young, really very much so into high school years, I began to discover that I kind of have a love for philosophy, even though I couldn't have, again, articulated that, right? Because I was never exposed to it academically in any serious way. In hindsight, yes, I've always had a desire for wisdom, a longing for knowledge, and I was always a kind of mini scientist slash mini philosopher. It's very much my makeup, and it followed me all the way through up into university years.
Welcome to the Explorations Podcast, conversations bringing together philosophy, the arts, education, and more to explore a life well lived. I'm your host, Luis Hernandez, and I'm going to introduce my first co-host, Edwin. Edwin, how are you today?
I'm doing good, Luis, doing good. Looking forward to this.
And got to bring in our other host, the newly minted Dr. Joseph Terry. How you doing today, Dr. Joe?
Yeah, I'm feeling good, feeling great. Really excited. Thank you for this, and just looking forward to talking with you guys today.
Today is going to be a very special episode because we are diving into the world of academia, but through Dr. Joe's eyes. You might have heard us allude to it in a prior episode, but Joe is on a journey of completing a dissertation and becoming a doctor. We are proud to announce that that journey has been completed and Joe is officially a doctor, Dr. Joe.
Thank you.
For the sake of this podcast, we want to talk to Joe and just kind of look at that journey, specifically his dissertation journey, but the bigger picture of his academic journey. Just knowing Joe for all these years, talking with him and Edwin, I think there's a lot of valuable information to get from it. So I just want to jump right in. And Joe, I think the very beginning of your academic journey is fascinating to me, and I think will be fascinating to the listeners. So can we start from just the very beginning, like just the very start of the public educational system? Because you grew up out of the public education system. Can you just start there before we jump into you getting your PhD?
Yeah, absolutely. As I've shared in previous episodes, born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, and came up right through the public school educational system in the city of New York, K through 12. My head start, in fact, pre-K back then, my mom put me in a yeshiva.
Oh, really?
Yeah. In the Junction in Flatbush, Brooklyn. My first experience, like half a day pre-K back in the day.
Right.
And I was definitely being immersed into the Jewish theology. I would spin dreidel. I remember being very conscientious about eating kosher. I would tell my mom, we have to eat only kosher. So when we would go to the store, we would look for that. Yes, this is true. This is back in 1984.
Wow. So sidebar, did you have like a Jewish identity somewhat at this point?
Yeah, like this Afro-Latino in the middle of Flatbush, Brooklyn in 1984, going to a yeshiva for Head Start. And definitely, seriously, I remember playing with the dreidel and bringing it home and talking to my mom about being kosher. I mean, I'm not being hyperbolic. Like, this was really very much a part of it. It was a wonderful experience. I remember my teachers and Orthodox women, the whole thing. And they loved me. I loved them. I just remember having a really nice time. Then I came into the public school educational system at kindergarten. I remember my kindergarten teacher. She was very sweet, very nice, very pretty. I remember she was like, wow, she's really pretty. I remember for some reason I stood out, but super sweet. And then it's like fuzzy. And then I'm in first grade. We moved. And so I began, I think it was first grade at PS 209, right behind what was called Cornelian Hospital, which has been renamed as South Brooklyn, I believe, right there in South Brooklyn, PS 209. And my essentially first through fifth grade experience was there. Now, what's really interesting is that I had a number of learning difficulties, we could put it like that. One of them was that I was a pretty bad stutterer. And I remember meeting with a speech pathologist for perhaps just shy under a full year, a really, really positive experience with that. But it was through the stuttering and not reading on grade level, I was a bit hyper, but I was never diagnosed with ADD or ADHD. They put me in special ed. And a lot of people don't know this. This is part of my journey. And I want to say I began special ed maybe second grade, possibly even first. I would need to ask my mom. I would need to look at the records. But my entire K through, or rather first or second grade to fifth grade elementary school experience was one within special ed. And there's a lot that I can share about that, but I'll just give you a quick overview, and I'm sure you could follow up with some questions, Louis. But elementary school was at PS 209. Then I went to middle school behind the infamous Lincoln High School, and that was junior high school. In my experience, great time over there, even though it was pretty rough.
Wow.
And then high school was at Edward R. Murrow High School up until 12th grade. So. Yeah, those are my schools in the New York City public school education system.
My first question for you is, how did being a part of the special education system, were you aware of what special ed is in the context of like public school? How did that affect how you viewed education, kind of being within it? And did that also have an effect on you socially, like interacting with other students and kids your age?
Those questions for me, Louis, are really tremendously significant, really pregnant with meaning for me. I say that because this has been for many years a topic of deep shame for me, this part of my journey. And so for quite a while, I wouldn't have had the ability to even talk about this without feeling less than and all of the other accompanying emotions with that. So that already, I think, gives an indication for all of us here, for our listeners, that there was a significantly negative experience. Now, all of that said, the whole thing wasn't like terrible, but let me explain why I experienced much of it as negative. There is a feeling, and of course, I can only speak in the I with this. I can't speak for anyone else, but there was a feeling for me that I was carted off. I was somehow segregated, to use that term loosely. I was put in another space, and I began to see that immediately when I was very young. I would say around 5, 6, because of the school bus. The school bus was different. It wasn't as clean. It wasn't the short school bus. It wasn't the smaller cheese bus for those students who've had maybe some other disabilities or whatever. But it was another bus that wasn't as clean. I remember it visually, picking it up. It was like more dingy looking. There were fumes in the bus. I would get sick. And we get dropped off, right? Picked up from the city housing where I was living, right? And Old Dwyer Projects, 33rd Street between Surf and Mermaid. I wait downstairs. This is during the crack epidemic. I remember seeing the crack vials on the floor. My mom was very present with me, and she would wait with me, and I would get into the bus and go to PS 209. And when I would get off the bus, I would see other school buses that are bringing in mostly lighter skinned kids. I remember there was a disproportionate amount of kids of color like myself in this sort of dingy bus, and these other buses, which looked super brand new at the time, really clean, kids coming out looking a little different. And so that was already a sort of mark. I remember kind of internalizing that. Of course, when I was going through the experience, I couldn't have in no way articulate any of this. This is all by way of kind of looking back. And then I remember the classroom being quite small. We only had maybe 12, 13 students in the class. And I remember the other classes being packed with like 25 or even perhaps even 30 students, or at least it seemed that way. And the reason why I knew about other classrooms is because while I was in special ed, half my classes were what is called, at the time, I'm not sure what they call it now, mainstreamed. So that meant when it came for classes like science and social studies and some others, I would be brought into the quote unquote normal classes, the classes that were filled, the classes with those kids who populated those nicer buses. And The feeling of, 1 hour, I had to leave my homeroom class of 12, 13 kids, right? Where we were busting together. For 1 hour, I would have to go to the other class into this alien other space, never really feeling accepted. I remember the gaze, the eyes of other students kind of looking like whatever. And it's like, who is this kid? And some were looking out of more curiosity than others. And I even remember vaguely the sense from the teacher, right? That I would come in and the teacher would be like, yep, you can go ahead, sit in the back. And there wasn't an animosity or a kind of negative feeling per se, but almost a sense of like, oh, okay. Almost like they were bothered or they were kind of thrown off like, oh, that's right. This kid comes in at this period. And so I would sit there and I'm in this other class with kids that I was not with throughout the entire day, right? In kindergarten, you're essentially with the same in that class, right? Courses. So what that did was it really inculcated within me a sense of shame, a deep sense of like, I didn't belong. I didn't belong somehow in the special ed class. I didn't belong in these mainstream courses, which were more than one. It was like 2 or 3 courses that I was mainstream for, which in hindsight, again, is an indication that there was some kind of curiosity, there's something puzzling about that, right? Because it was almost as if the system didn't know what to do with me, that I had a case. I don't know what they would call it back now. They use an acronym IEP, I think it is. My wife can correct me. She's a kindergarten teacher in the public school education system. So I had a file. I was a stutterer. I was meeting with a speech pathologist. I remember that I was not writing or reading at grade level, whatever that meant at 2 or 3 or 2nd or 3rd grade. And yet I was, quote unquote, up to snuff for the other classes, content-driven courses. Even was participating in the science fair and came in like 3rd place. And I would win all these awards. And yet I was a special ed kid.
I'm trying to figure out like the source of that drive. Like, was it the shame? Like, at what point did you find yourself like trying really hard as part of this public school education system? Was that always there? Did you always have like this hard working mentality when it came to the books? Or is that something that grew out of this experience?
If I could just add to that, Joe, as you're thinking about it, just listening to your story, acknowledging the others who are with you throughout that journey, we know where this ends up and where some of their fates are. And I think maybe some of those folks personally. Thinking through the distinction, right, towards Lewis's question here, the distinction between what made you successful in that environment, or how were you able to access that motivation?
These are such good questions. I've always had a kind of deep curiosity, a drive to know. My mom would tell you, if she was on the show right now, how I would set up all these experiments at home, very young, with my toys. I remember I had a number of G.I. Joe action figures, some Transformers, and the toys that I didn't really care so much for. What I would do is I would attempt to run different experiments. I would take the chlorine that my mom would have or the bleach, and I would pour it on the toys to see what would happen over time. I would then take one of my G.I. Joe action figures and put it in a glass of water with food coloring, then put it in the freezer for several hours, come back to see how it froze and the sort of articulation of the toy's body in the ice, and how it would, of course, break the ice. It would break the glass. And my mom would be like, Joey, what are you doing? So I had this kind of deep curiosity to know processes. How did this make sense? How did this happen? So thus my initial drive into science, which was no doubt sort of cultivated through a number of conversations with my dad at the time. So when I think about personal academic drive, of course, I didn't see myself as having a drive in the academy in my kindergarten years, but though I had a deep curiosity, would ask a lot of questions, was very much drawn to science, social studies. Math was difficult for me. I was not mainstreamed in math. The same with English, although there were certain concepts in math that I was very fascinated about. I would ask questions, but there's so much to say, right? Because the level of teaching or engagement within my special ed classroom, I remember it, again, distinctly being different than what was happening in the mainstream classes. The kind of the richness of the content, the speed at which the information was coming. and the teacher's pedagogical approach to really seek to challenge the students, that didn't seem so much present in my special ed classes. Now, it's interesting when I think also about the question that both of you raise or you invite me to think about in terms of drive. What I do remember is because of the shame, that distinct feeling of not feeling like I belonged anywhere and that they were just eyes of judgment or puzzlement always looking at me. What that did was I would sometimes attempt to not do the studies. I would sort of rebel because I felt bad. Now, this is a testament to both my mom and my dad because they would take seriously this kind of action that I would engage in where I was like, I don't want to do homework, or I feel bad. I used to tell my mom, I feel bad. I don't like this. I would cry. And she would say, there's more room on the outside than there is on the inside. So let it out. And we would process, we would talk about it. And she would encourage me to return to the homework. My father would call me. This time they were separated, but my father was very much present in my life always. That parenting really helped me to not drift away. Now, many of my colleagues at the time, right, the other students that were in special ed, I don't know their home life. I do know that I remember some of them just rebelling and they just didn't do the work. And there could be 1,000 number of reasons for that, right? Their own developmental skills, whatever they were wrestling with, as well as whatever was happening in the home life. But I can't imagine going through that process of being in special ed and not having mom and dad as present as they were, as intentional as they were. In fact, my mom was on the, what is it? The PTA, Parent Teacher Association. She was, she was super, super present. My dad, very present, not as much as my mom, right? But in terms of the school, because my mom would show up and she would serve and she was one of these like really super present moms. My dad would show up. I remember he showed up a couple of times in middle school and junior high school. So yeah, I mean, and those are other stories, but
I would like to open up a dialogue between you and Edwin to just take a step back. And because it's like, even with your dissertation aside, I feel like your experience through the special education program sounds like a success story in that both parents being involved with the student and that relationship with schooling, it just sounds like a success story to me compared to other stories that I've heard within that system. And I wanted to ask Edwin, with your understanding of the historical context of the public education system, is that the norm? What do you make of Joe's journey, just his early years of schooling? And Joe, like, feel free to jump in as well. But like, with your background as a professor and as an educator, I'm just like curious about this experience that it seems like common for children to go through, particularly like New York City kids who are coming with all types of different home lives, like you said, Joe. Like, is Joe's experience, like, is that an anomaly? How, looking historically on this school system, what do you guys make of it?
It's a great question, Louis. I think actually literally listening to Joe has sparked quite a bit in terms of the traits that are associated with what success looks like for students in our environment. And I will start with no, Joe's experience is actually quite unique, which is why I prefaced your question earlier with what was unique or different about your experience, Joe. Because statistically speaking, right, we know those socioeconomic factors are downward pressures on your likelihood to graduate, likelihood to succeed, likelihood, so on and so on. It's just like added weight onto someone's shoulder, right? So Joe can look back and say, these are the things that are making me successful in who I am. But at the same time, these are the same factors that drags millions of students in that environment down, and it doesn't allow them to push forward. I'm starting to think of things in terms of ecosystem. It's the equivalent of having a wildebeest in the wild where there's 10 times more lions in the environment versus another where there's probably 0 lions.
Right.
They're in a zoo, right? To me, at least, that pressure is And again, the ingredients that allowed Joe to be successful is super interesting.
Is it possible for the state to create a system that accounts for varying home lives or like these factors that they do not have direct control over? Because it just feels the way that you guys have kind of shared the experience and the historical context of the public education system, it seems like that's like a big ingredient. And then if it's like, oh, if your home life is not doing well, sorry. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Louis, you just asked the question that will solve education. That's the question we're thinking about all the time. Right?
Really?
It's like every administrator, every thought leader in education, you probably heard social emotional learning. And so that's at the core of it is how do we do that?
Is that like the biggest challenge?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, you can think about it, right? I almost want to ask Joe to go get his wife on the mic here. Because you could imagine the experience of a teacher, right? You're a teacher and you're responsible for 25 people, right? First, how do you pick out what's happening in the home life? Joe, you just said it, right? You were a peer and you had a hard time understanding what each other's family life was. Now you expect a teacher to do that. And so that's just being aware, let alone intervening. Right. And then intervening in that environment, I can't even imagine, Joe, one of your teachers saying, hey, let me go to your apartment out in Coney Island and have a conversation with your mom and see how things are going. Like so many things has to go right for that intervention to even be effective. So that's at the heart of the challenge.
What's funny, what you described, I immediately thought of like several movies where that happens. And it is kind of like a bit of a fantasy where the teacher visits the students' parents at their home and stuff, and like Matilda or something. And it's just like, wow, like what a present teacher. But you're right, that is definitely not the norm. You
guys remember the movie The Principal?
Yeah, The Principal.
It was like 80s or something. It was this principal that changed around the school, and it had all the stereotypes, right? He goes into this school and pretty much you have like a full-on gang war happening in the school itself. And then so he's like intervening and like eventually turns around some students and so on. Yeah. So when you said that, it made me think about how impossible that portrayal in Hollywood is when it comes to reality on the ground.
Let's turn to Joe's past elementary school. Let's go even to your university years. Can you just like first set the stage? What kind of student are you going into college? And then if you can kind of wrap that up with like the big decision in your academic career of like, I'm going to complete my PhD. Let's talk about that chapter.
Yeah. So very quickly, it was in middle school, junior high school, where I was finally, again, I don't know the term, but essentially I left special ed and I was put into the other sort of space. I don't know what to even call that, the quote unquote normal space, the regular space, whatever the case is.
Wait, real quick. Did that feel like an achievement for you? Like, or is it just like, it's just a new thing?
There was a feeling like, wow, I got out. Then it was a feeling of, okay, am I going to fail now because I've been coddled and given all these tools that now I may not have, you know what I mean? So there was some fear. I still had the lingering shame. My sense of self as a student was deeply marred and scarred through my years of special ed. Again, and kind of being caught betwixt the spaces of the quote unquote normal class and the special ed class. And so I carried that. But from what I remember, I did relatively well, came out of middle school, junior high school, which was IS 303 I mentioned earlier, and then got into Edward R. Murrow High School, which is a pretty good high school in Brooklyn, one of the largest high schools actually in America, having all of these programs. And I really did well in Murrow. Now, when you come out of special ed, they continue to give you support, and the support is typically called a kind of resource room. So because you have this IEP or this case or whatever the language is used, the school will seek to continue to offer services, whatever those services you may need. Typically it would come in the form of time and a half for exams, right? And so I had that available and was strongly encouraged by the resource room teachers, right? For those who kind of run those, for me to take the time and a half. And so what that actually did was it prolonged the feeling of shame, because here I am now in high school in Murrow. And when it came to exam time, whatever the exam was, or even a quiz, the teacher would know, whatever for that subject, that I had a resource room. So they would fold the exam up, put it in an envelope, give it to me, of which then I would in front of the class and take the exam down to the resource room, you see? And then I had time and a half. So it was great. Like, wow, I had extra time. But the feeling of shame, again, continued. It lingered because it was like, oh, this kid gets extra time. And why is he getting extra time? And he seems normal. And in fact, he's really smart in this class. He's always raising his hand or whatever. How the hell was like, what, you know? And I mean, no one is saying this to me as a student, right? I'm internalizing, right? And I'm sort of self-dialoguing here and sort of projecting and mind reading and saying, this is surely what other students are saying. And I think part of what, this is just a sidebar, and I know I'm going to get to more of your question, Louis. I think part of the level of shame that I incurred and those sort of negative feelings came about because I am, in terms of my psychological makeup, quite sensitive. I have, I think, a certain degree of social and emotional intelligence. I'm really good at reading people. And so what that means is I live in a kind of pathos, a kind of empathetic space where I can sense typically what people are feeling. And so, as you can imagine, if you're in that negative social space, you're really feeling it, right? Because the radars are up and so on. Anyway, going all the way back to elementary school, I had a great love for science, and I've mentioned this in past episodes. And so when I got into the University of Rochester, which was a wonderful accomplishment in and of itself, I was really excited, mainly because they had a program in astrophysics, which is really rare, a university having an undergraduate program in astrophysics. That typically, to do those studies, you have to essentially go for your master's. So I was really excited. I know they had an observatory. I was like, yo, this is great. So I got in. And the rest is history, right? And I do those studies. I do philosophy, and I have this amazing experience. Didn't have any resource room at the University of Rochester. Didn't have recourse to anything like that. And in fact, in high school, I stopped using it, even though there was a lot of kind of pushback from. They said, "No, you should use it. You should use it." I said, "No, I don't want to use it." I was like, "I can't do it." And I knew I was going to university in college, and I was like, "I don't want to continue to do that in college," even though the universities, they have those supports. So yeah, so it was in the University of Rochester where I continued to sort of discover who I am, who I was as a thinker, as a student. And with that came a lot of growing pains, right? Because the level of shame continued, there were things that I just could not admit to myself. There were certain courses that were essentially beyond me, where I would understand it conceptually, but because of I was really hamstrung with my mathematical development. I was not really taught the tools that I needed. My math skills really suffered. So I had to lean heavily on friends like Edwin to help me get through a lot of the coursework in some of those areas. It really helped me to kind of make those connections there. So that space of, again, discovering who I was and whatnot continued in the university.
So as you're going through this discovery, I think it's important to look at the other side of this. What's driving you? Because in what you just said, there's a series of decisions that have been made, including the one to go into who does cosmology or astrophysics, right? Who makes that decision? So what's driving you on the other side of that?
I had a great love for the sciences and for the mystery of reality, hence my drive then into philosophy. I've been asked this question before, and sometimes people would ask, were you trying to prove yourself given your history? Like, were you trying to kind of like arrive in a sense of self by means of doing these, wild pursuits academically? And was that a drive? And I have to admit, the answer, as far as I am aware, now maybe there are unconscious forces that were propelling me, right, and maybe continue to do so. But as far as I'm aware, the answer was no. There was no sense of like I need to showcase and prove to myself and to the world that I can do this. It was really, again, a kind of, it's interesting. I almost want to use the word naive, but God forbid, a real longing to know the truth, whatever that meant. And so, yeah, hence my desire to discover inner processes and whatnot. So that was really the drive. In fact, Edwin, I'm really happy that you asked the question, because what this helps me to understand as well, this is something that I've explored in the past, is that I'm very much motivated by kind of intrinsic desires rather than extrinsic. But what that meant was, in foreign language class in high school, I did really poorly. I did very bad in my Spanish classes, ironically enough, right? That's because I really didn't care for foreign language. Well, I was raised in a home where my father being African American, my mother being Boricua, Puerto Rican, when I would hang out with my mom's side of the family, which was like 99% of the time, right? My extended family, my father didn't really have extended family except his brother who lived in Florida at the time. With my grandmother and her sisters and brothers, they would always, it's not so much my grandmother, amazingly, but my great aunts and uncles, they would almost shame me. They're like, yo, you don't speak Spanish? You know, and so I grew up with this. Maybe Louis, maybe you could kind of vibe with this as a boy.
Flashbacks.
Yeah. And so again, that internalizing mechanism, right? My high sensitivity coupled with my educational journey caused me a kind of great internal dissonance, such that I was like, yo, screw Spanish, bro. Like, and so I carried that into high school. I was like, yo, forget about foreign language, or who cares about that anyway? I'm like studying the stars. Right. So there's kind of like an arrogance and a pompousness, but it was really a defense mechanism, right? To say, oh, I don't need you know what I mean? This sort of psychological gymnastics. So that being said, the reason why I bring that up is I'm very much an intrinsic motivator in terms of learning. So if I'm being taught something that I don't give a shit about, excuse my French, I have the ability to simply tune it out and just barely pass, right? I didn't follow the rules. Like I would never disrespect. I would always do the assignments, but I would just be like, whatever. Right? So this idea of intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, very, very ingredient, I think, in my own makeup. And so again, going back to motivation and what drove me, it was really a desire to know. It was really a longing for the mysterious and to kind of get an insight into things, whether it was philosophical, scientific, and so on.
Would you consider yourself at that age, or if not even younger, like philosopher in the most literal definition of the term, as like love of wisdom? Would you consider younger Joe a philosopher at that age, or were you like just like what was that space like at that time?
My mother's long-term partner, who essentially was my stepfather, because he was in my life since I was the age of 6, Herb Roberts, passed away, was in the home, right, that I grew up in. So it was my mom, Herb, and me. And my dad being in a neighborhood over, right? So, it's interesting, a dynamic here. Now, the reason why I bring this up is that Herb was wonderful in bringing to my attention all kinds of music and literature. And one of the things that Herb and I would do is we would stay up really late into the night looking at National Geographic magazines, right? And I remember coming across this amazing issue. Man, I wish I could find it. That recounted the competing scientific, particularly physics theories of the day. It was this amazing issue with graphics and a wonderful way of describing the forces of nature, electromagnetism, gravity, the strong and weak nuclear force, all of these things. And I was just blown away. And Herb saw that, right? Herb saw that. And he was like, yeah, right? He would kind of encourage that. I would then take it to my dad. And we would talk about it. Again, I had this sort of insatiable knowledge or desire to know. There was in the National Geographic magazine that I come across some other things on, I remember philosophy or whatever. And so young, really very much so into high school years, I began to discover that I kind of have a love for philosophy, even though I couldn't have, again, articulated that, right? Because I was never exposed to it academically in any serious way. In hindsight, yes, I've always had a desire for wisdom, a longing for knowledge, and I was always a kind of mini scientist / mini philosopher. It's very much my makeup, and it followed me all the way through up into university years. And to your other question, Louis, I know I completely forgot to answer it. Where did my desire for a doctorate come about? That's a long story, but to make a long story short, I've always flirted with the idea. Edwin and I would have wonderful conversations at the University of Rochester about pursuing further studies, right? And maybe doing this and that. And I don't know if we had explicitly any conversations about pursuing a doctorate. Edwin is a kindred soul, so we were able to talk about these things and kind of rift together and resonate and say, yeah, we got to pursue this, we got to do that. And so that was like, it remained. Now, after graduating with a master's in divinity years later and other work, people were telling me, Joe, you should really consider pursuing a PhD. You really should consider. And I was teaching at Kingsborough at the time, and I was doing my master's and all of this. And people were telling me, both my colleagues at the college that I teach, at seminary and others, you should really pursue a PhD. This would be a great fit for you. And so eventually I got into it and I said, all right, let's do it. One of the things that held me back for many years is like, I don't want to incur more debt.
Right.
I just want to work.
Thing.
Yeah, I was like, but let me do it. And I found a great program that I was actually following from a distance for many years. Many of the thinkers that came out of the program, like Dr. John Milbank, Dr. Connor Cunningham, who ended up being my advisor at the University of Nottingham, some other thinkers that I really looked up to in the field of philosophy and theology. I said, let me give this program a try. I applied, I got accepted, and the rest is history. And I began my program really in 2019 and just defended my dissertation just a few days ago. And the most unspeakable thing occurred, because it's really rare, and I was not expecting, I was hoping for it, but I didn't expect it. I passed with no corrections. I passed the defense, the viva, with no corrections. And my two external examiners, for those of our listeners, you could look these guys up. They're pretty significant in their own fields. Dr. Aaron Ritchie's and Dr. Matthew Levering were my two external examiners. Wonderful conversation, beautiful time, tough, but great. I learned so much, and yeah, I passed with no corrections. So it's been a beautiful journey, and I'm just so grateful to continue the journey forward.
I would like to give the listener just a brief sense of scope at the work involved that you had to undertake to kind of complete this and get your PhD. So if you can just like outline the work that was required for you to not only complete the dissertation, but also the defense portion of it, that last step. Can you just kind of help us understand that?
So in the UK system, right, when you apply for doctoral studies, one of the things you must do in submitting is submit a research proposal, which is very different than doing a doctorate or applying for a doctorate in the States, right? In the United States, where you fill out the application like everywhere else, and you either get accepted or rejected. And in the UK system, you fill out the application, but you also have to submit a research proposal. Now, maybe there are some schools in stateside that also has some component to that. I'm not sure. I don't think so, because here in the United States, typically doctoral programs will include a year to 2 years of coursework with preliminary examinations. Then once you've accomplished that, you submit essentially a research proposal, which then has to be accepted. And then you write your dissertation for another few years, which is why doing a doctorate here in stateside can take anywhere between 5 to 7 years. Full-time. Full-time in UK usually is about 3 years. And that's because you're not doing any coursework. You're not having any preliminary examinations. You, from the front end, submit a research proposal. You have a conversation with a potential advisor. If she or he likes you and things are smooth, then they will encourage you to apply. No guarantee that you will get accepted. Again, you submit your research proposal and that's it, right? You either get accepted or rejected. If you get accepted, then through a series of meetings with your advisor, you begin to work on that research proposal, clarify it, strengthen it, support it. And you start to really dive into also some kind of literature review and whatnot. Now, Connor Cunningham, wonderful, wonderful Belfast boy from Northern Ireland, wild character, really amazing. And he was a wonderful advisor to me and really a good friend. he inundated me, with sources after sources. He's getting accepted into the program. And he's like, all right, here. And he started sending me email upon email upon email, all these PDF files, bro, all these readings. And he's like, yeah, and I want you to connect with this guy and my friend over here at St. Vladimir Seminary, which is like an hour from where you are, Joe. And I know a scholar who's an expert in this field over here at Fordham University. I want you to connect with him. So he was hating me like, I was like, oh my gosh, right? But I was loving it. I was like, this is fun, but it was like scary and overwhelming.
Right.
Yeah, did it. My research proposal changed significantly. Part of that is because of a kind of personal shift that occurred in my life spiritually, coming from the Protestant evangelical world into the Catholic world. And so that had a deep effect in my own thinking and the kind of research that I wanted to do. And then over those 3 years, then from that point on, you're writing. You're essentially writing your dissertation. You put together your first your first chapter, and you sort of scaffolding, you're building it. And in that, you're really close with your advisor. Hopefully you have a good advisor who is present and able to give you, because there are a lot of horror stories. PhD students can tell you the world over, right? If you have a terrible advisor, they don't respond to your emails, or they're late, or they just don't care. Right. And that could be really terrible. Bad. Yeah.
How long was your dissertation in total?
Yeah, around 87,000 words. Yeah, 87,000 words. The limit is 100,000 words at the University of Nottingham.
Overall, what was like that specific part of the process, like writing it all out? Was that challenging for you? Did you like eventually find a rhythm and a stride? How'd you navigate writing it all out?
My methodology was as follows. Before I began writing a chapter, I would create a detailed outline. And as I'm doing that, I would have graphs, because I have also a strong visual learning component to myself. So I would kind of graph out or visually seek to illustrate the ideas that I'm thinking about. So there was some like images there. I actually have all my sketchbooks and all of that kind of capture the work in that way, along with the words, accompanying words of it. Then when I was satisfied with the outline, then I would start writing the chapter. And as you're writing, the kind of magic happens naturally. It's hard to really articulate what's happening when you're writing. You have resources in front of you. You're quoting, you're citing, you're thinking, you're kind of drafting, you're revising. You really, really are learning a lot. I was learning so much as I was going through the sources and sort of doing the deep dive of writing it. And once the chapter was more or less done, I would submit the final chapter to my advisor. He would look it over. We'll have a conversation or a few conversations about it. This was good. This was maybe a little weak. You want to build this up, take this out, right? And this kind of conversation. And then when things were good, move on to the next chapter. And essentially that was happening like that for about 3 years. You're kind of slowly building the work. And as I was doing that, I was becoming more confident. The rhythm began to gel. I felt great. And that meant less need to rely on my advisor. I would always, of course, submit the final chapter to my advisor, have him look at it. But it wasn't kind of baby steps anymore, right? After the first chapter, I was sort of flying and I loved it. I loved it. Was it difficult? Yeah, it was challenging, but I freaking loved it, man. It was so sexy. I was learning so much. And because my work is a kind of dual disciplinary approach, right? In theology and philosophy, I had to do kind of both of those things well. The danger of doing something like that is you could bleed one methodology into another, and then it's not held in the proper distinction and unity. So I was doing kind of that. It was really wild stuff. And once it was good, then at the end, the advisor gives it a several look over the entire dissertation. Then we submit it to the university. And then the examiners are assigned. And then you have your viva, your oral defense.
Let's get into the defense, because it sounds almost like a courtroom type of environment, the way that it's described. Can you put us in your shoes leading up into it? How are you feeling? And what did you have to go through in order to get through this process?
I submitted my dissertation and I knew this was like the last major step, right? That was coming.
Yeah.
My advisor really wanted me to have some important examiners that he thought would be a great fit for the kind of work that I did, given the kind of work that I did. So he was able to secure these two very fine thinkers, these two amazing examiners, really good guys. I mentioned them earlier in the episode. And the date was set. I knew it was coming. So I had about 2 months to prepare. So what I essentially did was I reread my dissertation. Now, at this point, I went to Staples, I printed it out. And as I was going to reread it, which I began to do, I would annotate my own work. And as I'm doing that, I was seeking to kind of anticipate what kinds of questions that they would ask in light of my work, marking it up, things like that. And that was it in terms of preparation for me. I didn't do any mock vivas. I didn't practice anything. I said, well, it's going to be, it's going to be. That's it. That's the Brooklyn in me.
Right.
I wasn't nervous, but I was I had a kind of an anticipatory feels like, oh, okay, like almost an excitement, slightly nervous, but very, very minimal. And it began. The chair is assigned. Agatha, she arbitrates and oversees the defense. She set the ground rules. She had the two examiners essentially read their reports or open up with remarks. Each one kind of read what they wrote and just general impressions. Took about 20 minutes each, roughly, which then led to the Q&A. And the Q&A time was 45, 50 minutes maybe. Just questions and pushback. And why did you choose this source? And I noticed this. And what about that? And have you considered that? And we saw a couple of things here that you may want to reconsider using and this and that. And so as we were going through that, I was saying to myself, and I'm taking down these notes, even though I knew I would get the report later on, oh, I'm definitely going to have to revise.
Right.
they're pointing out some mistakes. They're like, yeah, we saw a few typos, a few typos and this and that. I'm like, oh man, there's a couple of here, this and that, and some other elements was like a strong pushback. Like, yeah, I wouldn't have done that. I wouldn't have made that move. You did it. I don't know. Da da da.
Oh,
I was like, okay, right. Yeah. So I'm like saying to myself, all right, bet, let's go. Right. So at the end, I get that she asks the chair, are there any other questions or comments? I don't know. I think I raised one or two questions to get their impressions about a certain idea that I articulated in the work. They gave their response, and that was it. Then he asked me to step out of the room, step out of the space. And I said, can I bring my wife back in for the judgment, right? For the outcome or whatever.
Right.
Agatha was like, sure. And it's going to be good news. So don't worry. I was like, okay, great. Right. And so I took that as, okay, pass. Most people pass a defense. I mean, you really have to screw up. Right? You really have to mess up to not pass a defense, like something crazy has to happen. So I knew I was going to pass. I was like, okay, I was pretty confident with that. And I said, okay, I'm going to pass with revisions. Hopefully it's just minor revisions, not major, where I have to rewrite a chapter or two. That would be like, oh my gosh. But good news. Okay, whatever that means. Came back 5 minutes later with Virginia. We're there. And Agatha opens by saying, well, after arbitrating and we would like to share with you the following. You have passed with no revisions. And I was beside myself. In fact, I didn't believe what I heard. So I'm sitting there like somewhat puzzled. I'm like, I don't know if I heard that. She said you passed with revisions. She surely must have said that, not pass with no revision. Right. Somehow my mind just was like, no revision.
Couldn't accept that.
Yeah. I was like, nah, bro. So we're there and they were like, and then they started showering crazy affirmations. This thing is like mystical. And what was like your prayer life when you wrote this? Something about the spirit in this. And it's groundbreaking. It's so unique. It's going to be a real contribution to this and that. And they were kind of sharing a little bit about that during the Q&A. They were kind of already sort of gesturing towards it, but they really laid it thick at the end. And that was it. And I said, okay, is there anything I need to do? Agatha said, no, you passed with no revisions. That means you're done. You're done. You're finished.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh my gosh. And Virginia spoke. She said, thank you guys so much. And one of the examiners, real sweet, Dr. Aaron Rich, he was like, Virginia, if you went through anything that like what my wife went through when I did my doctorate, you know that this PhD is awarded half to you. Essentially, like it's as much as yours as it is your husband's.
Right.
And so thank you for your support. And because it's really a toll, right, on the family, time commitments, etc. And that's it. And we bounced, and I actually started to cry. I actually started to weep because it was so overwhelming to hear that. Like, wow, you passed with no corrections, no revision. I was just like, what? They gave me great feedback for my book when I published it, God willing. And that was it. And we've been celebrating ever since. That was July 12th. Now it's July 15th when we're recording this. We've been turning up.
Right. I just want to add a personal note in here that, like, I can totally understand why you would cry in that moment, especially the context of your life and your education and academic career, like the big picture of it. It's like, it's such an accomplishment that supersedes you in a way, like I felt like I won something when I found out like that you became a doctor, I was like, yeah, like, like it just kind of uplifted. It's just like, it's more than about you. When I hear this story, when I look into this story, it is a personal accomplishment. I don't want to belittle that, like you did that, but it's just the impact of that. It extends past you. It's so easy for me to see in this situation, and I usually don't see stuff like that. So thank you so much for just sharing. I know you weren't able to get like as granular as you could in certain areas, but you just provide a really nice scope of like this public school kid who like went through the system, and then it's like, boom, now you're Dr. Joe.
From the hood to the academy.
Right.
And back again.
Right. That needs a bomb right here. Ready?
Let's go. Represent.
Right.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to share my story.
Absolutely. I wanted to ask you just like one final question in light of this. Just, is there any sense from you right now, like about the future, how you think about the future in light of this new context? Or are you still in a space, rightfully so, where you're like, I'm not thinking about that yet, I'm still processing it?
I'm going to continue to do what I do, which is to teach, to write, to read. I have some projects that I have in mind that I would like to pursue, some books, some articles. That doesn't stop. Of course, I'm celebrating now, and I'm like a hyper nerd, right? So part of my celebration is like sitting down with another massive tome and just enjoying it, like reading and thinking and kind of sketching out future projects. And I praise God for that, right? But I am embracing my limits, enjoying my time with my wife, and looking forward to a trip that's coming up in about a week or so. Edwin's going to be there, and we're going to be in Paris. We're going to be in France, and my wife, of course. And we wish you were going to be there, Louis. But we'll come back. We'll turn up together.
Right, right.
So yeah, the future is open as far as God will continue to give me breath in my lungs, health in my body, serenity in my mind, peace in my soul, and I'm able to be here and do good. I want to continue to do good. As generic as that sounds, I really mean that. I'm on mission. Unapologetically. I want to continue to share and offer whatever resources I can that come not only out of my noggin, but out of my entire self, my history. And I'm just so grateful to have that opportunity to teach, to do that in a city like New York City, and in a system like CUNY, the largest urban university in the world, where I'm able to teach all kinds of people and to share my story. Let's continue to do it. Let's all do it together. My word of encouragement for whoever's listening, let this be a testament to what any one of us can do. With God, all things are possible. Thank you.
Amazing. And Edwin, I wanted to get your take from your unique perspective, not only just your insight into the educational system and the work that you're doing today, but also you being Joe's good friend and being around his university years. As you heard Joe's story and as you reflect on just the education system as it is today, are there any thoughts or final word that you would like to leave with the listener in just kind of thinking about just education, knowing, knowledge in academia?
More and more, education is going to be a dividing factor in our world, right? With the advent of AI, what it means to be an educated person is going to define what it means to be successful in a lot of ways. In Joe's story, I hope listeners have heard how, and he has seemingly done the impossible. And what that means is that in some ways, the way we define equity in our world today can be realized through some of the journeys that Joe represents. Joe, I think your story is a beacon of hope in that environment. One of the things that I heard Altman say about his founding of OpenAI is that the first person out of the gate with that type of quote unquote power, a lot of it is data, knowledge, and so on, is going to rule the world. And if that's the case, how do we make it fair for countries that have been historically behind, societies, peoples that have been historically behind? How do we make it fair for them? I'm taking your story, Joe, and I'm extracting quite a bit here, but that beacon of hope means that we have some ways of making sure that we can leverage our tenacity around this, leverage our background to be successful. And so in your story, Joe, I hear you can overlay it on a country. I think of like Haiti and so on, and historically all the challenges it's faced and so on. What do we do for a country? And so then in your story, I hear like the insecurities and the challenges and the screw you world tenacity that is going to make both people's societies and countries successful. I think it's a deeper conversation. The hope I see is the hope in closing this gap and what I think has been fundamentally unfair world in our age.
Well, thank you both. We're going to, as always, continue to just dive deep and think long and hard about these things as we navigate this world that we're in. So I look forward to those conversations. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Louis.